Now, I've changed the title of the presentation. I know it's supposed to be initially on this idea of the wave of sectarianism, but this was what I did last year. I think I was somewhere, I believe I was somewhere in the US when I did it via Skype because I was traveling. So it's nice to be physically here with people and have that humanly interaction. But I thought that what is interesting, what has changed since then, of course, is that you have had the Indonesian presidential election. We also have a longer view of sorts with regards to what's happening in Malaysian politics. And, I thought that it would be interesting to look at this topic of the new spectrum of Islamism in Malaysia and Indonesia. Obviously, the ideas itself is the notion of Islamism, the connections between Middle East and Southeast Asian Islam would obviously have an impact in terms of how political Islam or Islamism is represented within the Southeast Asian context. And which is why I suppose we are having this session at the Middle East Institute. Now, let me first begin by defining what I mean by Islamism. If you're going to Google this term, you're probably going to have at least 100 different definitions. So I'm just going to, use a definition that I personally find useful. So this is that by a scholar, Salwa Ismail. Some of you might be familiar with her work. She's looked at the context of political Islam in Egypt and Algeria. And she's argued essentially that Islamism is an ideology that thinks of Islam as a system encompassing political, economic, and social systems, which seeks to bring about political transformation of society and state. And the key objective often of Islamism, or Islamists rather, is the implementation of Islamic law and the framing of economic activities in Islamic terms. Now, what is often Islamism is associated with perceived notion of piety. So, for example, your 5 basic rituals that of Islam: praying 5 times a day, the fasts during the month of Ramadan, and so on. Dietary habits, dressing, and so on. But often this is secondary to political transformation. For some of you guys who are more familiar with my work, I wrote my PhD thesis on a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir, which has chapters in about 51 countries. This is the predecessor of ISIS, a bunch of bourgeois who wanted to revive the historical caliphate, but believe in a non-violent approach to achieving that goal. And through my interactions with members of Hizb ut-Tahrir, in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Southeast Asia, this idea of the secondary nature of piety comes out very clearly. You might not have the most pious people who are members of Hizb ut-Tahrir, but the focus on politics is very strong. Examples of this, for instance, is if they are having a conference or a seminar, they would rather, and let's say there is a call to prayer, they would not stop to go and pray. They would continue with their activities because that seemed to be a more important objective than to pray immediately, right? So this is basically how I define this. Now, in terms of some of the dominant paradigms, specifically in the context of Malaysia and Indonesia, how we have understood Islam. Islam has historically, in the context of Southeast Asia, been deemed to be moderate, tolerant, traditionalists, right? So sometimes we see that the word Sufism, Sufi-oriented is being used to describe Islam in Malaysia and Indonesia. At the same time, during the 1980s especially, the whole Islamic capitalism of sorts, or the Muslim, ethics, capitalist ethics, ideas that were promoted by people like Dr. Mahathir Mohamed, who's still the Prime Minister of Malaysia after many years, and the late Suharto, who was President of Indonesia. So this notion that Islam is an economically, religion that is friendly to economic development, capitalism. At the same time, it is pious, encouraging piety within the Muslim community, which is sometimes represented not just by government policies, but also certain organizations, such as in Indonesia, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama. Now, currently, I think there is a debate, and I think some of you guys are engaged in this kind of in this debate. You might be writing on this as well, and so I'm offering my little opinion on this, which is that the notion the argument that has been put forth is that traditionalist Islam today is threatened by this foreign, Middle Eastern, and intolerant Islam represented by Salafism. In the case of Indonesia, the groups, the traditionalist groups, have argued that groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and the Hizb ut-Tahrir have threatened the shape of traditionalist Islam. Now, I personally have a different take on this. I think one of the arguments that has been put forth sometimes that is the notion of the Arabization of Islam in Southeast Asia. So I disagree in particular with this notion, and I'll explain why. Now, what I am offering, or what I'm arguing increasingly, is that when we think of Islam in Southeast Asia, when we think of traditionalist Islam that is supposed to be Sufi-oriented, all loving, singing, very relaxed in terms of its practice of the rituals and so on, I think we are stuck in a particular period, which is no longer true. So I think that there's a need for us to rethink this notion of what traditional Islam actually means within the context. Is it really this apolitical, Sufi-oriented, peace-loving kind of Islam, as argued by groups like the Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia, who have argued that they are presenting this notion of Islam Nusantara or the Islam of the Malay world, or in the case of Malaysia under the previous Prime Minister, this notion of wasatiyah or moderation, and the current government have argued or promoted this notion of rahmatan lil alamin, which means that Islam for all of humanity, or religion for all of humanity. So to me, these are there's a need for us to rethink what this actually means. Now, conceptually, so this is actually an ongoing work that I'm working on. Is a sub-interest looking at essentially the what we call the reinvention or the shifting boundaries of Sunni Islam in Southeast Asia. So I'm looking at this both in the context of Indonesia and Malaysia. Conceptually, we are looking at it from looking at boundary theories, boundary making and the remaking of boundaries. So basically we are looking at identity as intersecting boundaries. And we distinguish in our work, so I'm working on this with a couple of colleagues, between the notion of symbolic and social boundaries. So on one hand, this idea of symbolic boundaries represent a conceptual distinction which social actors often employ for categorizing material reality as well as time and space. Fundamental to this imagination, is a medium for acquiring status and resources. Symbolic boundaries, on the other, also separate groups and substantiate the feelings of membership and inclusiveness, right? Social boundaries, on the other hand, are objectified forms of social differences and stable behavioral patterns of association. So what we're saying essentially is that when we think of these boundaries, is it symbolic or is it social? What is symbolic and what is social is something that we are currently looking at. Now, what are some of the current trends in terms of Muslim political mobilization within the context of Southeast Asia? Now, here I use the word Muslim political mobilization. I've not used the term Islamist, political Islam necessarily, and I'll explain why. So one is that we have seen an upsurge, of course, of identity politics. This has been employed in the 2018 Malaysian election, the 2019, in fact, the 2014 Indonesian legislative as well as presidential election. It has been used earlier in the case of Indonesia in the Jakarta governor election, the West Kalimantan governor elections, and so on. So you have basically politicians who are using the identity card. So here is a photo of Anies Baswedan, who is the current governor of Jakarta, and he was very much involved in this. And prior to the elections, prior to him running as the governor of Jakarta, he was deemed to be, someone who's very pluralistic, liberal. He was described as being the Obama of Indonesia. But during the election campaign, he clearly used the identity card, utilized the Muslim card to unite the Muslim vote against his competitor at that point of time, the sitting governor of Jakarta. You also have the burgeoning lobby strength of Islamist groups, groups like the Forum Umat Islam in Indonesia, the Islamic Defenders Front as well. In the case of Malaysia, under the previous previous administration, you have a group called ISMA, the Ikatan Muslimin Malaysia, who all were able, these groups were able to essentially lobby, not necessarily in the actual political space, but outside the political space, either through interactions with politicians by convincing them that there's a need for certain changes in terms of policies, or mobilizing at the level, at the street level, showing a show of strength. So, for example, the anti-Ahok rallies, gathered nearly 1 million Indonesians. It was the largest gathering ever done in the name of Islam in the history of Indonesia. So clearly there is this move, and that show of strength on the part of groups like this, sometimes more often than not, convince politicians that, look, these guys are important, we need to engage them, and we need to think about how, we are doing this, and, perhaps look at how we can accommodate their interests within our own political objective. There's also increasing confluence between secular politicians and Islamist figures. So you have, for example, in the last presidential election in Indonesia, Prabowo Subianto, who's actually not, who's a well-known figure, who's known not to be a pious Muslim, who, in fact, I attended one of the meetings where this group of Islamists actually vowed to support him and pledge support to him. And he basically, started his speeches by, doing, by saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Assalamu alaikum, and things like that, which are basic, ways in which you try to posit a more Islamic image. And what is interesting is that he couldn't even pronounce his pronunciation itself was rather strange. So it was quite obvious that he was awkward in that space. This was not his natural space. But yet, he was, he worked with some of these groups, believing that essentially they could help him to win the election. He was wrong, of course. He lost the election. But here is an interesting photo. This man, Habib Rizik, who's the current, he's the spiritual leader of the Islamic Defenders Front. He's now in exile, self-imposed exile in Saudi Arabia. They visited him. This photo was taken in Saudi Arabia. Here is Prabowo Subianto, and this is another important figure within Indonesian politics, Amin Rais. Amin Rais, in fact, was one of the key mobilizers in the Reformasi movement in the 1990s that finally brought down, General Suharto. And he was never known to be necessarily an Islamist or a very conservative figure. But yet, when it came to the mobilization that took place, he decided to, be in cahoots with some of these more Islamist groups. Now, another area that I see, I think, increasingly as being important is what I see as a new arenas of mobilization. So, for example, social media movements, where you see mobilization taking place. So one very interesting example, I had an article, I didn't assign the article, but you can look it up on my profile on the RSIS website. It's published in a journal called Religion and Political Practice, where me and a colleague looked at what we call new sites of Islamization. So one of the movements, so we argued essentially there's a need for us to look at new expressions. So for example, radio stations, how radio stations are utilized, social media movement, and also films, how films are utilized in the Indonesian context to spread certain ideas, more conservative ideas, or in some cases more Islamist ideas. So one such group is a group called the Hijabers Community. So this is Anies Baswedan with a group of members of the Hijabers Community. It's a social media group. Basically what it is a fashion, it's a Muslim fashion social media group. It has hundreds of thousands, I think millions probably now, of followers. So these ladies, young ladies, very good looking in more, and so on, posting themselves in Islamic attire, giving fashion tips on how to dress Islamically but yet be fashionable and whatnot. But what is interesting is how they express themselves politically, right? So when it came to the politics of things, you find that they would be, they would support Anies Baswedan, they would support Prabowo Subianto, and more, and this is part, I think, of how they assume, that Muslim identity. So I think this is interesting and important because there is, we are often looking at the political side of things without necessarily understanding perhaps the more cultural or social dimensions of this process that's taking place. Now, so I'm going to now move on to look at specific examples of this mobilization that I cited. So here is the example of the street mobilization against the governor of Jakarta, Ahok. So he allegedly made certain remarks against Islam. I mean, he basically quoted a verse of the Quran, and it was deemed that it was portrayed as if he made fun of the verse, right? It was a verse basically saying you cannot choose your leaders amongst the non-Muslims. Now, he didn't quite. The actual statement was actually misconstrued. In fact, what happened was that they altered the video itself and what he said. So it was a fake video that was spread. But it was made to be that essentially, look, this guy has made all these insulting remarks against Islam, and we need to come out, to rally against him. Now, one other organization, the Majlis Ulama Indonesia, MUI, came out with a fatwa, and a fatwa, by the way, is not the word of God. A fatwa is simply an Islamic opinion of a cleric. It is not religiously binding. So it's just an opinion of the Majlis Ulama Indonesia, and by the way, the head of the Majlis Ulama Indonesia is the current vice president of Indonesia, and he basically came out with a fatwa saying that this guy has insulted Islam. And so as a result of that, the groups like the FPI, the FUI, and so on, were able to galvanize large numbers of people on the streets. Now, Ahok himself, prior to the mobilization, his approval rating stood at above 60%. I think it was 65%, if I'm not mistaken. But yet he lost the election, right? So this mobilization was very successful. It was useful. It was effective. And I think, of course, there are numerous reasons to why this happened, why they were able to mobilize so many people. Now, I think one explanation, of course, is that there has been a conservative turn in Indonesian Islam, that there has been, Islamism or the influence of Islamists have increased. That's one opinion. But there were a multitude of different reasons as to why people came out. So, for example, many of the Chinese businessmen themselves in Indonesia supported the anti-Ahok rally because they were unhappy with certain policies of Ahok. One of the groups that is actually very apolitical, they are proper Sufi, very traditionalist, the Majlis Rasulullah. They are apolitical generally, but they decided to come out. And in fact, they are followers of Habib Umar bin Hafiz, Habib Umar bin Hafiz, who is based in Tarim in Yemen. They seek the permission of Habib Umar whether they could actually, join the rally. And Habib Umar said, no, you can't join a rally like this because it's un-Islamic. But if they are going to do a maulid, basically a big zikr, which is a practice of supplication, where you say certain verses of the Quran, then that's okay. So what they did, all these groups decided to have a massive zikr session. All right, and so they joined because Habib Umar say it's fine to do that. And here you can see the dimensions of the Middle East coming in. Now, why was it that they were unhappy? A very simple reason. For every year, they have a few 100,000 people. Every year, they have a particular celebration during the Prophet's birthday. So they had it at a place called Monas, which can obviously accommodate a few 100,000 people. And Ahok basically prevented them from doing it. They've been doing it for years. But when Ahok became governor, he prevented them, saying this is a circular space, you can't do your Islamic events here. And this is very harmless. The event itself is about, again, about promoting peace and so on. And yet, Ahok prevented them from doing it. So they came out not because they support Islamism, but because they were, Ahok attacked them, right? Unnecessarily from their perspective. Now, so what happened then? Of course, he lost the election. Subsequently, he was jailed as well. And that movement, because of the success of that movement, this group then formed a network called the 212. 2nd of December was when they held the event itself. They held the protest or the rally. They call themselves the 212 Alumni Movement, and then they started mobilizing in different elections. They had another victory in West Kalimantan, where traditionally you have two main groups of people, the Dayaks and the Malays. And the Dayaks, you have the Christian Dayaks and the Muslim Dayaks. Generally, the Dayaks voted in previous election, along ethnic lines. But in this particular election, they were able to mobilize the Muslim Dayaks to vote for the Muslim candidate at that point of time. So it was the first time where you actually had a rupturing of the Dayak vote, where Muslim Dayaks and Malays came together to vote for the Muslim candidate. So that was another success. Now, the presidential election came in, and of course, they lost that election, and it was seen to be a bit of a they were slightly demoralized. But I think what is interesting to note is that in the next election, they actually have a candidate now. And they have already spoken very openly about it, which is they want to support the current governor of Jakarta, Anies Baswedan, as the next president of Indonesia. And I think if Jokowi and some of the PDIP and others, they cannot marshal a suitable candidate, a strong candidate, I think there's a very good chance that Anies Baswedan could win the next election. Now, another dimension, another example, and this is something else in terms of the expression of this new spectrum of Islamism, is this trend called the Safari Dawa in Indonesia. What is the Safari Dawa? It is basically attempts to try at converting indigenous groups to Islam, all right? And this is happening throughout Indonesia. There are numerous reasons as to why this happened. I went to a particular area in Jambi, in Sumatra, where there's a group called a Suku Anak Dalam. And what got me interested in this, why I went to Jambi, was because I saw, I met this man. I know him fairly well. Sobri Lubis, who's the current leader of the FBI. So every time I go to Indonesia, I try to meet him. He's good resource for me. So Sobri Lubis basically declared that, just mentioned in the passing, I just came back from converting a bunch of people, right? So, and I was like, okay, who are these people? And then I got, interested in it. So I went and I found out what they were doing. Essentially, the FBI led this conversion process. So I went to find out why people converted and so on. And what was interesting is that I met the mayor of Jambi, the head of Jambi's Legislative Assembly, and others. And of course, the reason why many of them converted has to do with the fact that they wanted what is known as the KPK card, which is the identity card, and you need to have a religion before they can, issue you a card. So there were practical reasons as to why people converted. But the mayor of Jambi is from Golkar, which is a secular nationalist party, and the head of the Legislative Assembly is from the Parti Demokrat, another secular nationalist party. And both of them, when you go to their office, there's a big picture of them with Habib Rizik, the leader of FBI. And they basically gave the FBI the space to basically conduct the conversion process. And in fact, the conversion process itself took place in sort of an open area right in front of the office of the mayor of Jambi, right? Which tells you a lot about the kind of access that groups like, and this is what I mean by the galvanization process that is occurring outside of the political system. You don't need to be voted into parliament, you don't need to be voted into the provincial assembly to necessarily gain access, right? So the assistance of FBI played a crucial role, of course, in the conversion process. And that, is not the only place where Jambi is just one example of this convergent process. It's happening in many other parts of Indonesia, and often groups like the FPI has been given access. Why? Because they believe that the FPI can assist them at a political level. By aligning themselves with FPI, it is assisting them to secure more political support. So there's a very practical reason. Now, there are other reasons. They actually believe in the cause in many cases. Many of them, these two individuals, for example, are very pious Muslim. You can see quite clearly the way they speak, the way they express themselves, and so on. So this is another example that I wanted to cite. Now, let's now move on to Malaysia, where we had, the difference, I think, between Indonesia and Malaysia is that in Malaysia, the Islamic Party, you have an Islamic Party which has remained overtly Islamist in their orientation. Now, what do I mean by this? The Islamic Party in Malaysia has not ceased in their objective to try to implement Islamic criminal law. And this is really interesting because if you look worldwide, you look at the Middle East in particular, this is not necessarily the trend. People have moved away from the trend of supporting the implementation of Islamic criminal law. A lot of Islamist parties have basically renounced Islamism or the Islamist objectives at least. So the An-Nahda in Tunisia, for example, has declared itself to be a secular party, that it has dichotomized or it has separated its political role vis-a-vis its role as an Islamic social movement in terms of their, what they call Dawa and things like that. But yet, in Malaysia, this continues to be an important factor. Now, in the last election, what is unique about PAS? Everyone sort of dismissed PAS as being a non-entity. Everyone thought PAS was not going to even win one parliamentary seat. They were wrong. PAS won 18 parliamentary seats and won the state of governments of Terengganu, Kelantan, and had a good showing in Kedah and Pahang as well. Now, and what I think is important is that PAS was the only party that went into the election without any alliance, meaning they didn't have any sort of alliance with any other political party, which to a certain extent tells you its actual strength. Now, with regards to the other political parties, it's highly dependent. They cannot claim that, okay, this is our level of support, because they come together, you are bringing together a level of support from different political outfits. But in the case of PAS, we know that this is what PAS has, and it's about 15 to 16% of the overall popular votes. Now, PAS tapped on, and why? Because PAS was able to tap on a network of Malaysian religious scholars, and they have been building institutions. So, for example, the largest childcare and kindergarten providers in Malaysia is an organization called PASTI. PASTI comes under it comes under the PAS Youth Wing. The PAS Youth Wing basically controls PASTI, which again, from that network alone, I think they have 150,000 students attending, their kindergartens and childcare. That translates to about 300,000 parents who are voters, all right? I'm particularly interested to look at the long-term. So I've got a theory that, PASTI is an important conduit in terms of PAS's sort of grassroots mobilization. I think it'd be interesting to trace, voting patterns and the existence of PASTIs, because if you look at where PASTI started, they really started in the northern states. So Kelantan, Terengganu, Kedah, Pahang as well. PASTI has a large number of kindergartens, and I think it'd be interesting to see whether there is a trend in terms of when these institutions were built and how PAS subsequently do during the elections. Now, the Islamic civil society space in Malaysia is also one where we are seeing a lot more, especially after the last election, where you have a new government that has come in. This government is deemed to be anti-Islam, anti-Malay. It is deemed to be dominated by the Chinese. Of course, this is, I said deemed because it's not true. You still continue to have key positions within the government held by Muslims. But there are numerous groups like the Gerakan Pembela Ummah, for example, which is PAS linked. Many of the leaders of Ummah are PAS leaders or PAS supporters at the very least. And they have been able to lobby for policy changes. So, for example, Malaysia wanted to ratify two international conventions, ICET and the Rome Statute. And as a result of the mobilization, street mobilization, particularly of groups like Ummah and others, they have been able to enact policy changes. They have been prevented the ratification, or there's been a U-turn in terms of decisions being made by the current government as a result of this lobbying process and street mobilization that is taking place. They have launched public campaigns, for example, the latest being this campaign to buy Muslim first. I think there has been a bit of a misrepresentation of this. The campaign is not a campaign of against non-Muslim businesses. So they emphasize very clearly, if you look at it, that you buy Muslim first. If you cannot find anything that is Muslim-owned, then you go to the non-Muslim, right? So, but the way it has been portrayed is that this is about, boycotting non-Muslim owned businesses. There is an element of that, for sure, but I think the focus is about building this Muslim, entrepreneurship, Muslim to ramp up, I think, the Muslim control over the economics and things like that. Now, what does this all tell us? I think that a couple of things that I think is important to note. One is that there's a need for us to rethink Islamism. When we think about Islamism in general, we associate Islamism with certain ideas. Now, in particular, that of the Muslim Brotherhood of the Middle East, to a lesser extent, the Jamaati Islami in South Asia. To a lesser extent as well, we have often, conflate, at least in the context of Southeast Asia, Salafism, which is this puritanical version of Islam coming from Saudi Arabia, with Islamism. And I think that this is not quite the case. Now, when you look at PAS, when you look at FPI, when you look at Forum Umat Islam, none of these organizations are Muslim Brotherhood linked. None of these organizations are Salafi. All of them are traditionalist Muslim groups. Now, in terms of their Islamic practice, they are traditionalists. They would celebrate, for example, the birthday of the Prophet. They would celebrate, for example, Sufi rituals, and so on. And now, that does not necessarily translate to them being apolitical, them being pluralistic, or embracing progressive ideas. And I think this is important for us to rethink, because right now the narrative is this, and especially at the policy level. I'm in a think tank, so I suppose I should talk about some of this from a policy standpoint. If we are targeting Salafism and saying that Salafism is bad, and in Singapore, I think this has been the case, Salafis have been banned from coming and so on, we might not be necessarily barking on the right tree. Because it is not, I'm not suggesting that we should constrain Sufis and traditionalists, but I think we need to be a bit more nuanced in terms of how we are thinking about this from a strategic standpoint. The second is the Islamist influence in government. We often are worried when Islamists do well in elections. That's like a disaster. When the Islamists do not do well, you're like, okay, good. The Islamists, they are marginalized. Now, I think this is also a problem, because there has been a mainstreaming, I think, of political Islam. Political Islam is no more no more the project of Islamist political parties. You don't need to be in parliament to enact policy changes. You don't need to be in parliament to push for certain agendas. You can remain outside of that space and still do it, either on the streets, at the policy level, civil society space. So there are multitudes of different areas that we're looking at. Street mobilization, I think, increasingly is becoming more important. It's not just in the context of Southeast Asia, even in South Asia, in places like Bangladesh and Pakistan, this has been a trend where street mobilization of Islamic groups to push for certain agendas. And I think most importantly, the new sites of mobilization, right, that we have not looked at. I've given the example of the hijabers community, and then this is, a poster of perhaps the most, do you know this? Anyone not familiar with this? If you're in Southeast Asia, if you are, you probably know Ayat Cinta. It is I think this movie basically cracked all historical records of movies ever to be made. Now, another movie cracked that record. It's called Ayat Cinta Second, volume 2 of the. Now, what is interesting about Ayat Cinta is that it was based on a novel written by a guy called Habibur Rahman Al-Shirazi. who is a member of the Prosperity Justice Party, the PKS, and who studied in Egypt and was very influenced by the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, when you look at and this is in my article, I discussed this, but when you look at certain conceptions or certain ideas that are being promoted in the movie, it is very much in the culture of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, for example, this idea of ta'aruf, for example. So, you don't go on a date. So, someone else comes in, a friend comes in between to assist you in linking up to the girl. The attires that you wear, how do you greet each other. And Ayat Cinta has had a massive impact in terms of how it has changed. What Ayat Cinta did is probably, in one movie, probably surpassed anything that Indonesian Islamists have tried to do in the last 30 years. They were able to, so for example, one of the trends that we begin to see in Indonesia is the covering of the face. Now, even Sobri Lubis said once to me that it's funny because both the leader of the FBI and its spiritual leader, their wives don't cover their faces, but now our followers, many of them are covering the faces. And he attributes Ayat Cinta as being responsible for creating that norm. All right. So, and I think this is important because we, again, look at Ayat Cinta as simply a movie. There's no, but when you actually dig deeper, there is a political project of sorts behind it. Habibur Rahman himself, actually, in various interviews, have admitted to it that he wanted to change certain ideas. Now, so in terms of our thinking of rethinking the Islamic categories in the context of Malaysia, now I think that we need to basically rethink the boundaries of how we understand traditional Islam. I think there has been a diffusion of traditional Islam where now there are numerous expressions of traditional Islam that has a very strong political expression, has a very strong expression of intolerance, for example. And I think this is important to note. Why? On two fronts. For Muslims themselves who are traditionalists, I consider myself more of a traditionalist Muslim. I think there's a need to draw a line between what traditional Islam actually. I don't want to be necessarily associated with people like FBI, FUI, and so on. So there is that dimension. But at the same time, at the policy level, we are trying to understand where the problems are, where this intolerance and lack of pluralism has come in. Another dimension, and I personally we all have our biases. I don't necessarily, I'm not crazy about the ideas of Salafism. But Salafis, if you ask me, who in the way we have portrayed Salafism, we have often argued that Salafis are the perpetrators of this intolerance. But rather, I think they have been a victim of intolerance in the sense that many of the traditionalist groups that I spoke about are against Salafis. They have called for the banning of Salafis. Salafis in Malaysia, for example, today, really have problems speaking in a lot of different mosques. Salafis have problems, there are fatwas from the Majlis Ulama Indonesia arguing that Salafi ideas are divisive and we need to do something about that. Right? So a lot of this intolerance that we are seeing also come from traditional Islam against Salafis and of course against the others like Ahmadiyya, Shiites and others. So when we talk about bringing back the local, when we argue essentially, to engage the larger discussion on Arabization, I think, we need to, again, be nuanced. What do we mean by Arabization? Because the Arab world is huge. Moroccan and Algerian, I've been to Morocco and Algeria. Islam is completely different from that in Saudi Arabia. And when we think about, if we assume here Arabization means there is a puritanical dimension of Islam, I don't see that to be the case, because in places like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria to a large extent, Sufism, traditional Islam, in its apolitical Sufistic way is very, very strong. So I think we need to be nuanced in terms of the usage of these terminologies. And the second, again, we are assuming here that somehow Southeast Asian Muslims and Southeast Asian Islamist actors do not have agency. They have agency, and they themselves can produce certain ideas. And I think there has been this production, local production of certain intolerance that we have seen, which is a Southeast Asian version of it. And also local, manifestation of more inclusive and pluralistic Islam that I think we need to acknowledge. The last point I want to make is that, again, when we think largely about Southeast Asian Islam, we are thinking of Southeast Asian Islam as simply being, or Southeast Asian Muslims being consumers of this larger trend, be it the Saudi trend, the Egyptian trend, and so on. I'm arguing that, in fact, at least with the case of Malaysian Islam today, Malaysian Islam is an important producer of its version of Islam and is exporting its version of Islam to many parts of Southeast Asia. Now, if you go to Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, you go to any mosque, you speak to many Muslims, if you know Malay, chances are you would have no problems doing research in these countries. Most of the imams, most of the religious scholars have at one point or another studied in Malaysia, and they're bringing back with them ideas that are coming out from Malaysia. The same in Sumatra, for example, in the Riau Islands, in Singapore. Right? This Malaysian Islam, to me, is a lot more important than, let's say, the Egyptian, Saudi versions of Islam. It has a lot more impact, in terms of how we are understanding. So I hope I've confused you even more. I probably think you guys have become more confused, but I hope that will generate some discussion. In the spirit of shamelessly promoting myself or my work, I've got 2 books that are coming out that discuss some of the ideas that that I've discussed. And in particular, this one that is coming. I think we are going to have a book launch in Singapore on the 7th of November. So it's an edited volume. We actually had about 14 researchers on the ground doing the research for 2 weeks prior to the election. We have chapters looking at places like Kelantan, Terengganu. Islam, of course, is a major part of the discussion. So this book is coming out. And I have another book that is coming out towards the end of November. This is a edited volume, looking at pathways contemporary Islam. So this is a larger discussion on Islam. It's not just specific to Southeast Asia. We have some Southeast Asian-centric papers, but we have, for example, Olivier Roy, who has written a lot on, this idea of post-Islamism, political Islam. He has a chapter in there. Ibrahim Musa, who has talked a lot about the reformation of the Islamic thought, about the Islamic education, and so has a chapter. And then we have a couple of people who are Southeast Asian experts on Islam writing on this. This should come out, you can pre-order it already, but it should come out anytime at the end of November. So I shall leave it to that, and I look forward to the discussion and questions from all of you. I can stand, actually. I'm sitting the whole day. Yep.
Thank you. You delved into the state of politics in Indonesia. I guess it's an interest of mine because I used to live and work there as well. And you mentioned the increased influence. Even the secular parties are embracing the FPI and those such groups. What I'm wondering is, if the influence of Islam in Indonesian politics, that dial has been cranked up over the past 10 years, let's say, probably longer, but just to put a number on it.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is, does that dial only go one way? Is that because a lot of the current discussion is that the proposed new bill that would have, if you believe the headlines, would criminalized extramarital sex and alcohol and all the things tourists like to do. That's still getting pushback. What I'm wondering is this level of Islamic influence in Indonesian politics the new normal, or is there a way to turn the dial the other way for Indonesia to kind of reclaim that status as the bastion of secular, in an Islamic country with a secular government that works?
Okay. Anyone else? Similar question? Or Comments? Now, I think that so I'm talking about Islamism, so I'm looking at the impact it has and so on, but definitely there is, in the case of Indonesia particularly, more than Malaysia, the counter views are very strong. I mean, it's not weak at all. I mean, PDIP, the party is very circular, and I think they have been rather aggressive in terms of trying to stem this trend, of, if you like, more intolerance and so on. I don't like to use the word Islamization, because Islamization itself is not a bad thing. I mean, if somebody is just becoming a better Muslim, praying 5 times a day and, donating money and being nice to people, that's fine. I mean, what we're looking at really is the political intolerance that come, or at least in certain expressions of Islamization. So I think there are counter views. The Nahdlatul Ulama, for example, have been very active in terms of countering some of these views. The problem is that Nahdlatul Ulama itself is very divided. So you have the what in Bahasa they call NU structural and NU cultural, right? So the grassroots and the leadership. At the leadership level, they seem to express this idea of Islam Nusantara, more tolerance, pluralistic ideas, and so on. But at the same time, at the level of the grassroots, it's not quite the same. In fact, many of these guys I met from the different political parties would often say, I'm from an NU background, right? But, my imam or my leader is Habib Rizik. Because why? In terms of the Islamic practice itself, FPI is a traditionalist group. It is NU-oriented, if you like, because they believe that in terms of the practice of the rituals is similar, right? But it is in the social-political side of things where there is a difference. So I think that there is a counter-reaction, except that I think that the reality is that we do have, I think, a new norm, a new normal where these ideas or these notions of intolerance would become more mainstream. It's not going to go away for numerous reasons. Now, what that means, I think, will be interesting, because there is a contestation of sorts that's happening, and what comes out of that contestation, I think, will be interesting to see. But at this juncture, my own reading is that this is likely to be the new norm in the case of Indonesia. That doesn't mean, you see, I don't want to be an alarmist as well. That doesn't mean that you're going to have Taliban-like people all around the country and doing all sorts of funny things. No, it's not like that. Even if you meet members of the FPI, many of them are your regular Muslim dude. They just want to be pious Muslims, right? They have stopped, for example, one of the things that FPI used to do is to go around destroying bars and discos, and they have stopped doing that because they realize that is not, that doesn't give them a good image. So there is, in the process of this mainstreaming that is happening, there's some good that's come out of it. I mean, there's probably less inclination towards violence, violent actions, and whatnot. Even with the groups that support the 212 movement, there are many of these former Salafi jihadist type who are part of the Aksi 212, and now they are going on the streets demonstrating. And so Abu Jibril, for example, a very famous figure within the old Jama'ah Islamiyah, he was a key figure within this movement. And so instead of him planning some attacks, he is going and doing this within a particular setting, which is more peaceful, And so there are certain aspects, nuances, in terms of how we're looking at that has come out. I mean, there are positive aspects of this as well. It's not all bad news. So. And if you go to Indonesia, if you're not a Muslim, if you come from Europe or America, people are not going to treat you differently. They're not going to look upon you as an infidel. And I don't think treatment at an everyday level, at a social level, necessarily has shifted and changed. I think our concern here is really what it means in terms of the trajectory of politics in the country. So, yeah.
You mentioned briefly about Arabization. I think it was a bit glossed over because you mentioned.
Do you have like a whole program on Arabization?
No, I just wanted to ask, because the terminology Arabization has been repeated many times by policymakers in Singapore and Malaysia. can you just explain a bit what is Arabization? How is it linked to Islamism? And is it even a useful term? And should people still continue using it?
Now, I think our understanding of Arabization is that there has been a shift in terms of culture. So, for example, instead of wearing the traditional baju kurung, which most Malay men would wear to go to for Friday prayers and so on, now you are finding people wearing the jubah a lot more, right? The Arabic. So that's one. Terminologies, for example. So in the past, people might use the term tudong to describe hijab. Now if you say tudong, people might not even know because hijab has become more mainstream. So another example would be, so terminologies like, in the past they call it buka puasa, right? When you break your fast, it's buka puasa. Now it is iftar, right? So that is deemed to be, a change that is occurring within. And in South Asia, the most famous one is that, so in South Asia, in Urdu, normally people say goodbye by saying Khuda Hafiz, right? It's a Persian, Khuda is it's from the Persian language. It means that God bless you, essentially, right? May God be with you. Now they're not saying Khuda anymore, they're saying Allah, Allah Hafiz, right? And I've seen this trend. I've been to Pakistan and Bangladesh quite a bit. Okay, so that is that expression of it. You have a lot more women, for example, deciding to wear the hijab. Now, I think that there are many reasons as to why this is happening. Part of it is globalization and how interconnected the world has become. I often talk about how if we are going to speak about Arabization, we need to speak about Koreanization as well, because I think the number of Malaysian Muslim girls who are into the Korean culture and the food and the K-pop and all that is probably a lot more than what you see with the Arab world. I don't think they know who Nancy Ajram necessarily is, for example, right? So there is that dimension of culture that is not just coming from the Middle East or from the Arab world; it's coming from elsewhere, as well. I think that what comes with this notion of Arabization is a notion that somehow we are, Southeast Asian Muslims are becoming a lot more inward-looking, a lot more insular, less pluralistic, less tolerant, intolerance, and so on. This is the implication of Arabization. Now, the first part of it, okay, we can argue there is a form of Arabization, but like I say, in the same breath, we need to talk about Koreanization, right, and other cultural influence, Westernization. But where I disagree is what this means. Right? Does this mean that people are becoming less, tolerant and all that? And even if we agree on that, is it true it's because of Arabization? So my argument is that I think that this influence coming from the Middle East or South Asia is true in the 1980s and up till the 1990s. But today, if you turn off the tap completely, meaning somehow or other you don't hear anything from Saudi Arabia, from the Salafis, no money coming from Saudi Arabia and everything else. Everything is shut, right? I think that the Islam in Southeast Asia has taken its own form and will continue to grow and express itself in that particular way. And that unique expression is precisely what I just said, that the diffusion of traditionalist Islam. Because if it is true that we have a problem with Arabization, then the Salafis will be everywhere. They will be the dominant Islamic expression. The Salafis will be the one pushing for the implementation of Islamic law and blah, blah, blah. And that's not true. We don't see evidence of it. Salafis remain very marginal in all three countries, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. It's the traditionalists who have pushed more for this. Brunei is a very good example. They have Islamic criminal law. Salafis won't even dare to call themselves Salafis in Brunei. They would be in a lot of trouble. So it's a traditionalist state. They go by the MIB, Melayu Islam Beraja, and they have implemented Islamic criminal law. So it's got no necessarily Saudi or Salafi influence of sorts. So I think we just need to be nuanced, because like I say, if we are focused on a root cause that's not quite a root cause, then we have a problem. If we are focused on the implications of it, that is not quite the case. I think we have a problem. Another point that I want to make is this. I've traveled around the Middle East quite a bit. I love the culture and so on. And like I say, I see a lot of differences. It depends where you are. Even in Saudi Arabia, I would argue, easily 10 to 15% of Saudi Sunni Muslims are Sufi-oriented or traditionalists. That's not dead completely. It was, that culture was alive back prior to the rise of Wahhabism. But it remains that. So we can't just, broad stroke and say the whole of the Middle East is this. It's not. I mean, there are nuances. Even within UAE today, for example, the Abu Dhabi royal family and the Dubai, they are different. I mean, Abu Dhabi is supporting a lot of the Sufi scholars like Hamza Yusuf, Habib Ali Al-Jifri, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bai'a and others. And that's, can we then argue that, okay, Gulf, Islam coming from the Gulf is all Salafi-oriented and intolerant and so on? Because Hamza Yusuf does not preach very much a message of pluralism and tolerance and so on. So I think that also is a problem because we don't understand a region and we are broad stroking, I think, a whole region as being this, and that's not true. Last point I want to say, I think there's always been an intolerant trend or segment of Muslims in Southeast Asia. If you look at the Darul Islam movement, for example, now, it was an armed struggle for the establishment of what? A Negara Islam Indonesia, an Indonesian Islamic state. What is the origin of Darul Islam? It's not from the Afghan war, it's not from the Saudis, it is a local. Some would argue many of the leaders of the Darul Islam even believe in mystical aspects of Islam. They believe in magic and things like that, which is a lot more local, right? So I think we are ignoring the fact there is a diversity, even historically, within Southeast Asian Islam, and that this is all just coming from the Arab world. Yeah.
Hello. You mentioned very briefly about Malaysian Islam and how it's being exported to different countries in Southeast Asia. Could you just say a bit more about what you mean by Malaysian Islam and what exactly are you saying is being brought to other countries within this region? Because when I think of Malaysian Islam, I just think of its strong connection with this really Malay identity and sort of Malay nationalism. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that there are numerous, it's still research, it's an ongoing research, right? But what I can perhaps highlight, I think when we talk about the influence of Saudi Islam or Turkish Islam, because we've been talking about Saudi Arabia and Turkey as being exporters, they engage in Islamic soft power diplomacy and so on. And in the case of Turkey, prior to the Gulen movement being clamped down, I think the Gulen movement was an important instrument, and what they do is very different from, let's say, what the Diyanet, which is officially linked. The Diyanet is very similar to the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore. It's the official religious bureaucracy of Turkey. What they were doing is quite different from what the Gulen people are doing. So there is also a multitude of different Islamic expression coming out from these different countries. The same with Saudi Arabia. I think when we think about the World Assembly of Muslim Youth or the Muslim World League, the Rabata al-Alam al-Islami, I don't think that those guys, especially in the 1990s and 80s, can simply be described as Wahhabis or Salafis, because most of these organizations were staffed by the Muslim Brothers, who at one point, I think most of us who know the history would know that they were aligned, they were given refuge by King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. So with Malaysian Islam as well, I think we are seeing a number of different expressions. One is from that Islamism linked to the Islamic Party, PAS in particular, and to civil societies associated with PAS. So that's one. And then the second, of course, is the government position. There are organizations or the bureaucracy itself. The second. The third is, I would say, groups like ABIM, for instance, that have done, or IKRAM, Pertubuhan IKRAM Malaysia, that have done a lot of humanitarian work and so on. Islam that have invested in Islamic education and so on. So there are at least three different trends that we are looking at. Now, in terms of what it means, it is different depending on the trend. But you are right. I think that anchor, that Malay anchor, the anchoring to that Malay identity, Malay culture in particular, I think is strong. So, for example, I've said in terms of language, a lot of these people speak Malay. If you look at the curriculum, for example, the books that have been produced and so on, depending where, in southern Thailand, for example, they still use the old Jawi transcript, the old Malay transcript and so on. But a lot of these books are also produced in Malaysia, right? And then you have humanitarian activities, people building mosques. So the imams tend to be trained in Malaysia. Again, it depends. It could be someone who studied in a pondok owned by an Islamic scholar who is a sympathizer of the Islamic Party, who's oriented towards that. Or he could study from, at the International Islamic University, where ideas, are more influenced. The ideas from the official state Islam is much stronger. So it depends. But these are some of the areas. As I've said, this is very early research we're doing. We have numbers, for example, in terms of graduates from the International Islamic University, but it's not easy because with the pondoks and so on, it's not as, there are hundreds of pondoks in the country. So we have identified some that are more popular with foreign Muslims, and this is basically an area, we want to look at those numbers and so on. But in certain other aspects, it's quite clear, right? So in terms of the humanitarian, we know we've done interviews with people, we know what is going where. And all that has an influence, I think, over how people are thinking about religion and so on. And also, I think in Malaysian Islam in particular, because of the cultural affinity, in a lot of ways, is more attractive for many Southeast Asian Muslims. So that, I think, is important. And then, of course, the most important one that I forgot to mention is the religious scholars. So a man by the name of Azhar Idrus, for example, he's traditionalist, a sympathizer of the Islamic Party. He's extremely popular. From my perspective, for very wrong reasons, because people tend to ask him questions about sex, and he tends to crack jokes about sex, which is problematic in so many ways. If you look at it from a gender studies lens, it's extremely problematic, the kind of things that he's saying. But that's Azhar Idrus. And then there are many other examples so previously there was a guy, Kazim Ilyas, as well, was very popular. Among the Salafis as well, some of the Malaysian Salafis are quite popular amongst the Indonesian Salafis and others in southern Thailand and so on.
Just follow up from these gentlemen's questions. Can you explain to us the way the ideas have been trained? Because you have people who hold a doctorate degree like Jamihan from Jakin, who got a PhD. And he said that Chinese are dirty because we use toilet paper. Doctorate holders. And then you have another guy called the Mufi or Perlis, actually been UK, got a PhD from UK. He seems neither here nor there, sometimes become very controversial.
Yeah.
So what has gone wrong with the educational system?
Now, so Zamihan is a very interesting example of someone who is a traditionalist, who holds very strong views against Salafis. Basically, he would argue that Salafis are kafir, or like they are infidels, right? So he's a hardcore traditionalist, but yet, expresses himself in a very intolerant fashion towards non-Muslims and so on. So I can't say that people like Zamihan is necessarily a product of the educational system alone. I think people are different. I think he has a particular gripe with the Salafis, and that is what he's been doing. And I think that it's not fair for us to say that that Malaysian education system produced people like Zamihan. Zamihan represents a particular extreme position. There are others who are a lot more mainstream. But I think what I see more than the educational system is the politics of identity in Malaysia. The current there is a strong perception amongst Malays, for example, in Malaysia, that Islam and the Malay identity, or Malay culture is under threat. when you have a finance minister, an attorney general, and others who are not Muslim, or not Malay, I think there is the argument being put forth right now by the opposition that there is a threat against Islam, a threat against Malay culture, becomes a lot more mainstream, and it becomes something that is well accepted and by others, by many amongst the Malays. And it is this insane sense of anxiety that has fed into the narrative of people like Zamihan. With Dr. Asri, I think his position is a lot clearer in the sense that he is Salafi-oriented. I think he has been accused of that. But I think, yeah, I mean, we can more or less say that he's Salafi-oriented. So in certain aspects, some of his views, it can be very progressive, but in some other views it's not. So for example, the Zakir Naik issue, right? Why is it that he defends Zakir Naik? It's because Zakir Naik is also Salafi-oriented. So there is that commonality. So I think we need to start looking at that. Not necessarily that this guy is neither here nor there. He has a position. It's just that how that position is expressed, it's very contextual. So.
As you mentioned, we are here in a think tank. I'm curious, so how, if at all, do you think like this new configuration of political thought might influence Indonesia or Malaysia's foreign policy? Because it's not like they weren't Muslim. Previously, they were big supporters of the Palestinian cause,
Yep.
Suspicious of like Western influence in the region. But how, if at all, might this alter what they do on the international stage?
So, coincidentally, I just published an article with two colleagues. The title of our article is Dancing with the Ummah, Islam in Najib Razak's foreign policy. So, we argued essentially, I mean, the narrative with Najib's foreign policy is that he has sort of stayed away from positioning himself as a leader of the Muslim world. Because he does not have the credentials to do so. But we argued against that, and we found at least three different ways he expresses Islam in Malaysia's foreign policy. Now, and this is fairly, I would say, similar to what other Malaysian leaders, Abdullah Badawi and Mahathir, have done in the past. So one, Malaysia is a savior of the Muslim Ummah. So he speaks about the minorities Muslim minorities that are being discriminated. So with Najib, he looked at the Rohingya issue. Mahathir used the Bosnian War as that was his cause essentially. And of course, more recently, he went to the UNGA advocating the cause of the Kashmiris and the Uyghurs and whatnot. So that's one area. The second is, interestingly, which seems contradictory to the first position, and of course they stand up for the rights of Palestine, support Hamas and whatnot. The second is that all of them have tried to portray this notion of Malaysia being a moderate Muslim country, an exemplary moderate Muslim country, right? So in the case of Najib, he has this conception called wasatiyah, which is, the centrist moderate position. And he utilizes that wasatiyah idea in his foreign policy to argue that we are the guys who are going to stand against those bad Muslims, right? The extremist Muslims. I mean, I've got another article. So this is three articles we are working on, which looks at the role of Islam in international relations. So there's another article that we haven't started writing, but more or less the argument we are putting forth is that in a lot of ways, this notion of being the exemplary moderate Muslim country in itself, buying into the narrative that it tries to basically counter. Because who defines the moderate Muslim? Who defines the extremist bad Muslim? It is done by the international community, which is very Eurocentric, Western-centric. And so there is a buying of that narrative. The third way in which this is done, of course, is for the domestic audience, right? Is the consumption, is an extension of domestic policies to show that Malaysia is doing something for the Muslim world. So I think there will be, I think there is an impact. Jokowi more recently have talked about this idea of Islam Nusantara. And talk about the idea of promoting this Islam Nusantara idea internationally, that Indonesia can potentially play the role of being the center of, moderate Islam and things like that. So I think it will have an impact. Now, whether it will lead to an anti-Western position, that they don't want to, they're going to boycott Western products and all that, I don't think that's going to happen. It's never going to go to that extreme. But at the rhetorical level, you will see a lot more of it. So, I mean, and this is, again, not unique to Malaysia, right? Imran Khan, for example, recently, the Prime Minister of Pakistan gave an impassionate speech about Kashmir. While at the same time, in an interview with Al Jazeera, basically said, when asked about what are you doing for the Uyghurs, since you are a close ally of the Chinese, basically saying, oh, I'm focused on my domestic issues. Kashmir is considered a domestic issue from Imran Khan's perspective. So you choose your battle, essentially. With the Uyghurs, there's no way. China is one of Pakistan's biggest allies and will support Pakistan in many of its policies. There's no way they're going to touch on the Uyghur issue. So Kashmir, has traction with the domestic Pakistani audience, and he's going to use that issue. Not because he probably cared too much, at a personal level about it. And it is huge. I mean, you go to Twitter, you look at how people are hailing Imran Khan as the savior of the Muslim world and the hero, and they are so proud. Many Pakistanis are very proud of the fact that he has spoken up for Kashmir. So it has traction. It's very powerful in that sense. And we cannot underestimate that even in the context of Malaysia. So. And there's a funny story, when Mahathir spoke up for the, I think I can't remember when, but he spoke up against Israel. So the people in Gaza did a rally where they had, they thanked, what is the name of the organization? The Muslim Relief or Islamic Relief, something like that. And this organization, so they had the logo of the Muslim Relief, which is actually an organization that is linked to PAS, the Islamic Party. But in the same banner, they had photos of Mahathir as well as Said Sadiq, the youth minister. It was because of when they decided to ban the Israeli athletes from coming to Malaysia for I can't remember what it was. I think one of the games is an international game. The swimming meet, right? So that's the irony of it. Despite the fact that, they don't even know who's who. But, it has a particular attraction for the people in Gaza, so. Yeah.
Would you comment about the situation in Singapore?
What about Singapore?
Whatever that you discussed so far in this talk?
I think my take when it comes to Singapore is slightly different because often the narrative that we are looking at here is the narrative of, the creeping Islamization, right? This is happening in Malaysia, this is happening in Indonesia, so the Muslims in Singapore would be influenced by this. Now, I think simply because of the fact that Islam, to a certain extent, has been the most managed religion in Singapore, in the sense, because of various reasons, historical particularly. I'm not saying control, I say manage. There's a difference. I dichotomize between these two terms. But you have, because of historical reasons, you have the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore, you have the Administration of Muslim Law Act, all aimed at serving the needs of the Muslim community. So there is a reason why for example, people often ask, why don't you have a minister of Christian affairs or Hindu affairs? But you don't have the administration of Christian law in Singapore. You have an administration of Muslim law that impacts marriages, divorce, and so it's a very practical reason as to why that happened. At the same time, I think because of the bureaucratization of Islam in Singapore, I think all the mosques come under the jurisdiction of the Islamic Religious Council. The Friday sermons and so on are more or less the same. So from when a kid is in, and even the part-time Islamic classes and so on run at the mosque and by private institutions, all have a particular curriculum that is managed. So because of that, a young Muslim in Singapore grow up with a particular narrative and understanding of Islam. And often when you look at those who are involved in, let's say, certain like ISIS, for example, and others, more often than not, they don't have an Islamic background. More often than not, there are exceptions, obviously. More often than not, they do not have the background. So I don't think that, there's always this filtering process that happens to, okay, this is good. I mean, let's listen to Azhar Idros, for example, and let's take the good things that come from him. But certain things, when you talk about Islamic criminal law, you are losing the Singaporean Muslim. They don't, because it's not something that is applicable to them. So that is something that is filtered in general. Now, my concern is actually about how all these things contributes to Islamophobia. So, because why? Two reasons. One, as a person who's not a Muslim, for example, so my wife comes from a non-Muslim background. So often her parents would be very worried about certain things that happen. Right? I'm not saying they're Islamophobic, they're not, but when they read the news, it incites fear in them. And Islamophobia is, is about the irrational fear that you see amongst Muslims, amongst non-Muslims and so on. So that's one. The second is that we also have a big Malaysian diaspora in Singapore, people of Malaysian origin. And I think it's only human if you see, you hear and you actually see members of your family undergoing certain difficulty that you might associate certain practices that has nothing to do with Islam, but rather with politics, as being Islam, as being part of the Islamic tradition. And so that could possibly lead to certain Islamophobic sentiments. And I think this is where I'm more worried about that than necessarily the creeping Islamization, because the state itself has done so much to prevent this from happening. But I don't think we are investing as much in terms of countering Islamophobia, or we are how to manage the perception of Islam and Muslims and so on. But I can categorically argue that there's a huge difference between Singaporean Muslims and that of Malaysia and Indonesia. Sometimes when you sit down and talk to them, you lose them, right? So. Yep.
My question is quite similar to the very first question. Just wondering what your take is on the more recent demonstrations in Indonesia, and whether you kind of see that as maybe the starting of a sort of a pushback against Islamism. I mean, considering that they are, broadly protesting against a lot of some of these reforms that are backed by Islamists. So whether there's a pushback. So my second question is, you briefly mentioned on social media. I was just wondering what are the implications then on this traditionalist versus Salafi trends. I mean, how does social media help to shape this whole tussle between the traditionalists and the Salafi trends? Yeah.
With regards to your first point, I think your first question, I think it's a lot more, I think this I mentioned earlier as well, there is a contestation happening, right? That these views are not left uncontested. With Indonesia, there is going to be a pushback. Now, I think though, that pushback, unless it comes with certain state backing and so on, is not as strong as the ability of the more conservative Muslims to galvanize. This demonstration is nothing close to what we saw with the 212, demonstrations and so on. So that's the first thing. With regards to the social media and the contestation between the traditionalists and Salafis, I actually think that the generally Islamist groups and Salafis are better organized on the social media. Part of it is this, or I would say the more intolerant views are better expressed online, all right? So even with the traditionalists, you would find that groups like this Majlis Rasulullah, which is a very, very traditional Sufi, right? Apolitical, I'm thinking about the afterworld, I want to renounce this world and whatnot, right? they don't have as strong a presence as perhaps a much, much smaller Salafi group. So this is one problem, and the reason is also problematic because when you speak to some of these scholars, you ask them, why don't you have a strong profile online and so on. Even in Singapore, someone we have a lot of respect for, we tell him we need you to counter, but he said, no, I don't want to be in the limelight because that's a very un-Islamic thing to do. Because the moment you are in the limelight, you are creating, ego will develop, you become very proud of yourself, and we don't want these sort of things. So there is that problem as well. Now, with the contestation between traditionalists and Salafis, it is happening in a massive way, but both are equally intolerant, as I've said. What you're seeing in terms of the expression online is the intolerant traditionalists versus the intolerant Salafis. That is what we're seeing. So the outcome of it is really not necessarily something positive or good. It could be potentially largely problematic, if I may say. So, so that's one. I mean, for example, you have a web page, Facebook page, Singaporean Muslims reject Shiite Islam, and Singaporean Muslims reject Wahhabi Islam. The Wahhabi Islam one is started by traditionalists, but there's a lot of intolerance, a lot of views, for example, that is expressed to get the Salafis banned and to put them in jail because they're all supporters of terrorism and so on, and which is not true. The vast majority of Salafis are not violent. The vast majority of Salafis have nothing to do with terrorism. It's a very minute minority that has those positions or holds those ideas. Yeah.
What are the good and bad things that will come out of this new Islamism rising?
Okay. I've talked a lot about the bad things, so I'm not going to repeat. The impact of it, obviously, we know social cohesion within societies, the intra-Muslim conflicts, potentially it could lead to even violence between communal violence, for example, targeting of Muslim minority sects or sects that are deemed to be heretic and so on. So this is all what we are aware. Now, what is the good thing that comes out of it? I think the good thing that comes out of it is that it forces many Muslims who really just want to continue with their everyday life and not want to be involved in any of these things, which is probably 99% of the Muslims around the world, maybe 95%, to critically begin to think about these issues, to critically, educate themselves. If you you go to the hawker center and you ask a pakcik, an uncle or an auntie somewhere, do you know about the Salafis? Chances are they look at you like, what? That is what the reaction you're going to get. But increasingly, I think within the more professional class, the more educated groups within the Muslim community, there is an awareness and there is a desire to want to learn more, right? And that, I think, is a good thing because it will force people to question certain things, certain ideas that have been inherited from generation to generation. It forces people to rethink their Muslim identity. It forces people to rethink their interaction within plural, multicultural, multi-religious society. So that process, I think, is a good thing because if properly managed, properly educated, especially in the Singaporean context where there's a lot of engagement by many of the institutions, I think it can actually produce a positive outcome. When we're talking about contestation of ideas, these extreme positions are extreme, right? I mean, the vast majority of people are in the middle. And when more of the people in the middle start taking stock of the situation and start empowering themselves, I think there will be a change because the right now the narrative is being driven by the more extreme sides, regardless of whether it's extreme traditionalists, extreme Salafis, or extreme whatever, right? Or extreme Islamophobes, for example. So these are something. I mean, this is to me the positive aspect that can potentially come out of it.
Thank you. Maybe following from that question, in the Middle East, because of the image that political Islam and how it is associated with extremism and violence, etc., is driving a lot of young people towards away from Islam, to be atheist. And it's very strong now, especially amongst the youth, that you could, they are now very vocal about it in media, etc., etc. Is it happening here as well? Do you think this is an implication that could happen in South Asia as well?
Okay. This is interesting because I was reading some statistics, about Iran, for example. Olivier Roy, who have written a lot about political Islam in the Middle East, have argued that Iran is an example of, the failure of political Islam because, yes, you have an Islamic state, but you have a very secularized populace who might not associate with Islam in a massive way. A very good example is if you fly in, I've been to Tehran twice, I've been to Iran twice. When you fly in and out of Iran, it's interesting, for example, to see how people, might change their dressing and they might, take a couple of... Iran is one example, Pakistan is another, with regards to people drinking. In Pakistan, when you're leaving Pakistan, it'd be shocking how many people are like just drinking non-stop. Just observe if you ever have the chance to go to Pakistan, especially if you're flying with, Emirates or Qatar and so on. So there is that, and I was reading in Tunisia, for example, the number of people who actually officially declare themselves as atheists have tripled. Turkey as well, you are seeing some of those trends. Egypt, and so I was reading so this is really interesting. Now with Southeast Asia, we don't know the statistics because I don't think we have, or at least I'm not aware of any surveys that have been conducted, but I think that the people who are living Islam or who have left Islam are becoming more vocal. You would find that they are more willing to come out publicly. They have Facebook pages. They would form organizations or social networks of sorts to speak out against, against Islam. Now, I think that's not necessarily a good thing because the issue is not about leaving the religion. It's one thing to leave the religion. It's another to be Islamophobic because a lot of this, your council of ex-Muslims, people like Tariq Fatah, for example, Ibn Waraq and so on, people who have left Islam, who now comes out to say Islam is dangerous, the religion itself is problematic, and Tariq Fatah, for example, is very damaging because not only is he Islamophobic, but he is justifying violence against Muslims, for example. He is justifying what is happening in India with the Hindutva movement and Hindu nationalism, justifying that, what they're doing in terms of this cow lynching and what they're doing in Kashmir and so on, they're all perfectly fine, and it's problematic because then you dehumanize Muslims. So I think that there is that dimension. Now, within Southeast Asia, we have not seen that yet, but I think people are more willing to express themselves. I think if left on their own, if you have a completely free society where you don't have this religious bureaucracy that comes, breathing down your neck, you might actually see the expression of more expressions of Islamophobia amongst some of these people. But I do not know whether the numbers have increased. It's just that they have become more visible. But this is not necessarily surprising because with the rise of any ideas, there would be a counter ideological position, and this is not unique. Europe has, have gone through that phase, so this is something not necessarily unique within the Muslim world. So, okay. All right. So thank you very much. Thanks for giving me your time and.